You chose her like this, not me. My mother's words cut through the silence like a sharp blade, her voice full of anger and resentment. She stood on the porch, her eyes glaring, tightly gripping the divorce agreement as if it were a death sentence. The air inside the house felt nearly frozen. Lisa was holding the child at the foot of the stairs, Tyler clutching her leg, while I stood there, burdened with silence and anger, my eyes locked onto her face. Mom, do you know what you've done? I asked in a low voice, like suppressed dynamite, ready to explode. A trace of smugness flashed in her eyes as she sneered, you left, but I stayed. I am the master of this house now. At that moment, I knew clearly that my mother's hands had reached too far, she had control over the house, the family, and everything. I thought I would return from the military with some long-awaited peace, but instead, this tearing conflict shattered that illusion. Her control had long since transcended words, now taking shape in action. I couldn't endure it any longer. What I needed to do was to bring back everything I had lost, to protect my family, to protect Lisa, and to protect my children. My mother's mistakes would be exposed today, and she would pay the price. I remembered that when I was young, my mother liked to show me off in front of relatives as her achievement, but at home, she often treated me as her scapegoat. Every time neighbors visited, she would pull my hand and boast, this is my son, strong and sensible. He'll have a bright future. But once the door closed, she would start criticizing my shortcomings, my grades weren't good enough, I dressed poorly, and I didn't speak as well as the neighbor's child. She magnified my failures with sarcasm and made my self-esteem a source of entertainment. These small incidents piled up over the years, from my teenage years to adulthood. I learned to endure and hide my real anger. I remember the year I graduated from high school when I put my enlistment application in front of her in the kitchen. She held the paper, staring at it without blinking. You want to join the army? Then don't come back to be filial to me. Her words were casual, but at that moment, I saw satisfaction in her eyes. She didn't understand that it was my choice, that this was my way of living for myself. Later, every time I came home on leave, she would criticize me for making the family look bad, questioning if I had learned any bad habits. Those insults nailed me down to the position she imagined for me, little by little. When Lisa and I got together, my mother's controlling nature became even more obvious. Lisa is a gentle, practical woman. While I was away on business, she would put the kids to bed, fix broken windows, and take care of the little details of my life. Every time Lisa brought me homemade meals or the kids' drawings to visit my mother, she always had a stern face, like she was judging. She would say Lisa lacked manners, spent too much money, and wasn't good enough to be your wife. Every time I heard that, it felt like being pricked with needles, but I could only squeeze out, don't say that. I knew she was trying to control me, to make sure I would always be in her grip. But this time, my mother's actions went beyond words. Taking advantage of my absence for 8 months, she quietly put her name on some documents, secretly declared herself a temporary resident, and rushed to create some evidence before certain regulations came into effect. She participated in community events and whispered to neighbors about Lisa's wild behavior, painting us as irresponsible, absentee family members. She played the role of the loving grandmother in front of the kids, but behind our backs, she packed up our things, sold the dining table my grandmother had left us, and tossed the kids' toys into the backyard, claiming those things weren't necessary anymore. I had been humiliated and suppressed for a long time, but over the years, I also learned resilience. The military taught me patience and discipline, but it also taught me how to organize information and wait for the right moment under pressure. Every time during drills, would remember one principle: observe, record, and wait until the timing was right before acting. My mother thought that turning me into a meek child was enough, but she overlooked one thing: what I had learned outside wasn't the kind of blind obedience she imagined. I stored these memories in a dark compartment of my chest and would take them out at night to run my fingers over them, like sharpening a knife. I knew I had the power for revenge, because I wasn't just a man who could throw a punch, I was also someone who could use rules, laws, and evidence to restore the truth. My revenge needed to be calm, organized, and make her lose all dignity in the eyes of the law and the neighborhood. More importantly, I needed to protect my children, so they could sleep under a warm roof, not in some unfamiliar basement waiting for a letter from their father. During those days, I didn't rush to act. I had Lisa and the kids temporarily stay at her sister's house, gave them money, and provided them with all the resources I could immediately access. I returned to the military base, and handed over everything to Kevin, a friend I knew from my hometown, now the deputy sheriff of the county. Kevin was fair-minded and knew how to balance the law with human nature. He agreed to secretly help me gather evidence, check my mother's registration documents in the community, and verify the authenticity of her so-called residency proof. At the same time, I contacted a military legal aid organization, and in our first conversation, they broke the issue down into several key points: property rights, residency proof, civil disputes, and the evidence chain. We started preparing lawsuit materials methodically. Lisa began organizing photos of the items that had been sold and retrieving receipts for the items my mother had transferred. We asked neighbors if anyone had seen my mother take the kids and leave the house, or if anyone had seen anyone moving large furniture from our home. Surprisingly, some neighbors kept silent because my mother had been playing the "I'm taking care of the old soldier's family" card in the community, and they were half suspicious of her. My heart grew colder. All those years of humiliation and feeling controlled had turned into fuel. I wasn't just seeking revenge on an old woman, I was fighting to give my children back their home, to cut the web of control that bound us together. Through the first two parts of the story, readers should see that I'm not just an angry person, but someone with a history of oppression, dignity, and a strategy for retaliation. The memories of humiliation and suppression are concretized, and the potential for revenge and preparation makes sense. The following part of the revenge process will expand on the details, using dialogue and action to push the conflict towards its climax. What exactly do you plan to do? My mother, on the day she was summoned to court, looked like a frightened cat, trying to regain some of her former authority through her gaze. She was followed by an ally, a neighbor who claimed to have witnessed her residency behavior, but his eyes were evasive. The sunlight in the courtroom pierced through the blinds like threads of needle and thread, shining bit by bit on the folds of her clothing. Lisa sat next to me, holding the kids' hands. The children's legs were shaking, but they didn't cry. I tightened my grip on Lisa's hand, as if I were trying to piece together everything that had been broken. Your Honor, the property's title deed has always been in my son's name, but I have substantial evidence proving that I've lived here and have been abandoned. My mother's voice had a slight whine, and she pulled out several photocopies of emails, trying to paint herself as the victim. Her lawyer cunningly passed over a community volunteer form, on which it was written that she stayed at this address from Wednesday to Friday. My lawyer took these materials and casually said, "These documents show inconsistencies in timestamps and postal addresses. We've already submitted a verification request to the post office, and there is evidence showing these emails never arrived at this address in the past 8 months." He spread the evidence out on the table: bank statements, photos of Amazon deliveries, and screenshots of neighborhood security camera footage, where my mother's car entered and left, but Lisa's car was blocked at the door as she left. The judge looked at these materials, his brow furrowing. At the end of the trial, the judge announced that temporary residency rights would revert to us, and my mother would have to vacate the property and return any remaining identifiable belongings within a week. She deflated like a punctured balloon, her lips trembling, but she stubbornly vowed to appeal. We knew this wasn't the end, but it was a critical victory. On the way out, my mother hissed through gritted teeth, "You'll pay the price. You'll regret this." I met her gaze with cold indifference. "Mom, all we want is our home." However, revenge wasn't just a courtroom victory. My mother's reputation in the community was like a mountain, and we had to strip away her story, putting the truth on the table. Kevin helped us find the neighbor who had spoken for my mother during community events. Under pressure, he was willing to speak the truth. My mother often spread false rumors about Lisa, saying she had abandoned her husband and children to gain sympathy. We made these recordings public, and also recorded the neighbor's testimony. The community forum posts were gathered one by one, and the evidence chain grew more and more complete. At this point, my mother began to show her true rage. One day, she ran into Lisa in the supermarket and actually yanked the child's hat off, accusing her of losing the child. The video evidence and neighbor testimonies we presented exposed her lies one after another. Her social circle started to distance itself from her, and acquaintances who had once been willing to help gradually stopped answering her calls. My mother's space for action was shrinking, like a wild animal trapped in a corner, scratching at the narrow snare. One night, my mother appeared at our doorstep, wearing high heels, her face swollen, her eyes filled with defiance and exhaustion. She shouted loudly, "You think you've won? I have connections, I can have people make you regret this." I didn't rise to her provocation. Instead, I had Kevin step in. Kevin escorted her from the doorstep to the sidewalk, his tone neither warm nor cold. "Ma'am, this is now a civil dispute, and the police will intervene if necessary. Please cooperate with the relocation process." My mother stubbornly refused to leave, and the children were frightened, huddled in the corner of the stairs. I walked over, pulled them into my arms, and gently comforted them. My mother's performance seemed like the same old complaints and defiance she had displayed on countless occasions, but this time, there was no audience. In the following week, we traced the transaction of the dining table that had been sold to a second-hand furniture market. The table had been dismantled into parts and sold to a small vendor who offered exchanges for old furniture. The vendor admitted on tape to selling the table to my mother, and we followed the transaction records to trace the transfer of funds. Among the boxes my mother had moved and stored in the backyard were Nathan's childhood drawings, Tyler's first diaper, and letters Lisa had written to me when I was away. We carefully catalogued and photographed these items as evidence, which we submitted to the court. On the advice of a lawyer, we filed a civil claim, demanding that my mother return the items and compensate for emotional damages. My mother began to panic. No longer could she respond with the usual arrogance over the phone. Instead, she started babbling incoherently. "Son, you have to understand, I'm your mother. You can't just ignore me, don't forget, you owe me everything." I remained silent on the other end of the line. In the past, I would have broken down and backed down at this moment, but this time, I turned all the humiliation and resentment of the past into an irreversible calm. My response was simple: "Mom, you don't owe me money, you owe respect to the children. You took away their sense of security, and now you must return it." My mother let out a helpless wail. She began sending emails to relatives, describing her so-called persecution, trying to gain sympathy and support. But the modern world had sharper tools than her. We deconstructed her lies with evidence, then issued a community notice, calmly explaining the situation. People began to comment on the forum, saying they had seen my mother move things into her car, or drag children's toys to the backyard at night. The rumors began to turn against her. What truly made her lose control was when a small action at the bank was exposed. My mother had tried to cover up the money she received from selling the table by forging a transfer receipt, but the bank's anti-money laundering department discovered it. During a bank review, my mother was called in for questioning, and her face became as cracked as a dried-up apple. She hadn't expected the seemingly insignificant changes to be unraveled so thoroughly. The footage of her being questioned at the police station was carefully and legally obtained by our lawyer and submitted to the court. In that footage, her voice trembled slightly, and she was no longer the sharp, controlling figure she had once been. One late night, I received a call from Kevin. "They say your mom threw something in front of your door again and wrote something on it." I drove back to find a box of torn rags and some old toys piled up at the doorstep. A note attached read, "You are no longer family." The children had been woken up, and Lisa was trembling as she held them on the sofa. Tyler tore the note into tiny pieces, as if trying to crush the malice. In that moment, my revenge wasn't about retaliating with the same malice, but about exposing her violent behavior in broad daylight, making her feel the shame and helplessness of her actions. The final scene of the trial was when I had Lisa stand and testify about how she had sought help for 8 months, how she had called me late at night only to be intercepted by my mother. Her voice was steady, but each word hit my mother's chest like a hammer. My mother's gaze began to shift, unable to meet ours. After hearing the testimony, the judge gave the final ruling. My mother had to return all the items she had unlawfully disposed of within 2 weeks, pay a fine, and undergo counseling to address her controlling and intrusive behavior. More importantly, the judge issued a restraining order, barring my mother from coming near our family for a certain period. My mother collapsed outside the courtroom. Her once ritualistic threats turned into pleading cries. "Son, please, please don't send me to that place, I just want to be needed." She knelt on the steps, clutching my pants like she was trying to tie herself to my life. Her nails dug into my skin, and the pain felt like a small fire burning in my heart. I didn't immediately push her away. I crouched down and looked into her eyes. The years of humiliation, control, and hurt she had inflicted on me played out in my mind like a movie running in reverse. I could forgive her weakness, but I could not forgive the harm she had done to the children. I said softly, "Mom, what you need isn't pity from others. You need to face what you've done, and take responsibility for the consequences. You have to answer for your actions, and for the fear you caused the children." My mother sobbed, begging, I'll change. I'll see a doctor, I'll write an apology letter, I'll compensate. Just don't send me away, don't make me seem worthless." Her eyes were like pale goose feathers, trembling. Her voice was filled with terror and pleading. At that moment, she no longer had the authority to pressure us. My revenge wasn't about pushing her into the abyss, but about making her see herself in the light of day, laying out the evidence and law before her, exposing her lies and rendering her accusations meaningless. After her impotent fury, what she truly felt was tremble, the fear of losing all her connections, the fear of being exposed, the fear of having to face the consequences. The authority she once relied on had vanished, replaced by deep isolation. I witnessed her pleading, and I also witnessed my own resolve. I didn't send her to prison, nor did I retaliate physically. What I did was give the children back their home, restore their safety, warmth, and dignity to Lisa and them. That night, I sat by the children's bed, listening to their breaths as they slept, like hearing a heart being stitched back together. Nathan laughed in his sleep, and Tyler picked up the toy car he had lost the next morning, his eyes shining. Lisa leaned against my shoulder, her tears and smile interwoven. My mother was ordered by the court to undergo counseling, and she was forced to admit her wrongs in front of others. She wrote a letter of remorse, full of painful words and some excuses. The community didn't immediately forgive her, but some neighbors began to slowly understand the complexity of the situation. Our relationship didn't immediately heal, but I had learned to set boundaries. The final phase of revenge was a moral and legal victory. My mother went from being a controller to a beggar for help. Her impotent fury turned into trembling and pleading, while our home was restabilized. After being forced to face what she had done, she began the long process of repair. I knew she might never fully escape her need for control, but at least now she had to make amends in a way she wasn't used to, by facing and taking responsibility for her actions. The ending wasn't one of bloody revenge, but of justice realized. My mother cried outside the court, saying, "I will repent, I will change." I looked at her, without hatred, only fatigue and vigilance. I knew that there would be more trials ahead, but we had already rebuilt the most important thing, the children's sense of security and the boundaries of our family. Lisa hummed a song we used to sing together in the kitchen while washing dishes, Nathan planted the flowers my mother had trampled in the backyard, and Tyler no longer woke up crying from fear in the night. Occasionally, my mother would send messages with sharp, pleading words, but I never responded. Sometimes she would leave a bouquet of flowers outside the door, its leaves already beginning to wilt. I knew this was both her remorse and her vulnerability. We weren't without scars, but we had learned to clean them and continue living.